Today with Ray. Hello, my friends. Well, ladies and gentlemen, today we're going to jump on that gigantic, sharp, interactive board. I want to share my thoughts regarding GreatAmerica Financial Services buying a bank. Once approved by the regulators, GreatAmerica will own Heritage Bank out of Marion, Iowa. And folks, the new name of the bank will be GreatAmerica Bank National Association. Right off the bat, I could say that's a big name. I put a sign there, but look, I mean, that's just a lot of letters to put on a sign. The signs are going to be really expensive, let alone putting a logo on a shirt, change the name. And I'm thinking GABNA is easier. And it's easier to talk about, right? Hey, I got to go to the drive-thru at GABNA to drop off the checks, and I hope they got the lip balm there. But ladies and gentlemen, today's episode, let me share with you how I want to talk about this. The first thing I want to discuss is the press release. You know, a lot of times in press releases, what you see missing makes you think it should be in the press release, right? Thoughts on GreatAmerica and what I see as their exaggerated embellishment, which causes me to question, why do they do it? I believe GreatAmerica embellishes things, and that's always bothered me. Why do they do that? Why do they do that? So stick around for that. And thoughts on how I see GreatAmerica fumbling with human capital. I think it's important. If you're going to go out and buy a bank, you own a leasing company, you're doing all these things, you got to have the right people in the right seats. We've seen a lot of drama going on at GreatAmerica around senior leadership, around the brain trust of the company. I mean, there's a whole lot of people that have evacuated that company in the last couple of years, very senior leaders. And I've just got some questions around that. And thoughts on what I discovered regarding Heritage Bank. You know, there's this platform out there called Vizbanking. I found some information on Heritage Bank, and I'm like, holy crap, woo, this is a small bank, right? So I want to talk about that a little bit. And then I'll wrap it up with some questions. And then, of course, these questions could help, you know, the CEO of GreatAmerica, because I'm sure that he'll show up on a venue out there and maybe do a part one and a part two 6-minute videos and explain all this, but it'll take you, like 3 weeks to figure it all out. So I thought I'd come out here right off the bat and share my thoughts on this. But folks, let's start out with the press releases. So I go to GreatAmerica's website. I'm old, so maybe I forgot, but didn't they used to have news and blogs at the top there? I found only 10 news stories on their website. Had to go to the bottom of the website, click on news, 10 stories. And I'm like, boy, they cleaned this up. Why is there only 10 stories? And then I'm thinking, well, they got regulators looking at them. Maybe they wanted to clean up the stories. Maybe they thought some of those stories were nonsense. Who knows? But one thing I did notice, on the new revised website at GreatAmerica, the About Us regarding GreatAmerica changed. So I'll talk about that in a second. And then I saw the press release in the Quarter Business Journal. And folks, at the end of the day, I believe that GreatAmerica tells the Quarter Business Journal what to write about them, when to write it, and what not to write about them, which I think is a little bit crazy. But you know what I haven't seen in any press release I've read about this story? A whole lot around Heritage Bank, which makes me think, if there's not a lot of information about the company that's being bought, maybe there's not a lot to talk about regarding the company being bought. And after looking at some of the data that I found regarding Heritage Bank, ladies and gentlemen, I'm not sure there's a whole lot to talk about regarding Heritage Bank, other than the fact that it's a 100-year-old bank. Let's talk about the press release from GreatAmerica. You read all about it. I want to get to the bottom because this is important. A $3.5 billion company, GreatAmerica, was established in Cedar Rapids, Iowa in 1992. Has a staff of over 750 employees. And folks, first thing, I don't know why GreatAmerica has 750 employees. I brought this up before. They got $3.5 billion in assets. They're not a $3.5 billion company, okay? That's what I wanted to point out. A $3.5 billion company. No, GreatAmerica with $3.5 billion in assets, okay? That's kind of the way it should be said. I've been beating on them this for a long time. I think GreatAmerica has listened to that because on their About Us, they describe it as $3.5 billion in assets. They just forgot to do that down here in their press release. But folks, 750 employees is a whole lot of employees for a leasing company, $3.5 billion in assets. And especially with today's technology and AI, and we would all have to expect that sooner or later there's going to be a lot of employees that are not going to be at GreatAmerica. I mean, how do they have 750 employees? That's just in the beginning I could understand it because their motto was we answer the phone in 2 rings. So fill up all the cubicles for people to answer the phones. But I don't think anybody calls the leasing people, right? That much, right? Do they? Maybe some of the older people that don't know how to use a computer or something, but I'm pretty sure the younger reps and stuff, they're not calling the leasing company. Yeah, it's just kind of crazy. And then I'm thinking, is GreatAmerica even going to be a leasing company? Are they just going to become a charter bank? And how are the regulations of GreatAmerica owning a charter bank going to affect the leasing company? What's the purpose of becoming a charter bank? Did they buy Heritage Bank just for the licensing? Like they don't really care about the locations, they're going to shut them all down. A lot of questions, right? Ladies and gentlemen, the new GreatAmerica About Us, and I want to point this out, I want to congratulate him because it does say with $3.5 billion in assets. It doesn't say a $3.5 billion company. Again, they just forgot to do it above this. But they say something really stupid after that. So they're like, okay, Ray's right. We shouldn't be saying we're a $3.5 billion company. We should say with $3.5 billion in assets. And then they decide, but let's add this to it. And life-to-date finance originations of $16.1 billion. Who cares? This is unbelievably probably the stupidest thing I think I've ever seen. If I called up a dealer and said, hey, I want to do a story on you, and I need to know how much you build since the day you were in business. Add it all up every year. And I'm going to introduce you as XYZ company with lifetime billings of $1.5 billion. We won't need to tell anybody that you're actually a 100-year-old company and you really only do like, $10 million a year or something. I mean, folks, this is just craziness. Craziness. Why do they say? I don't know any other leasing company that does this, that publishes, their assets and then talks about their life-to-date finance originations. Totally insane. If you go to the Quarter Business Journal, and I've shared this before, but there was an interview, with their CEO and founder back in May of 2023, and it says revenue in 2022 was $278 million. So GreatAmerica, what are they? Did they go down in revenue? Are they 250 to 300 million? I mean, why are they embarrassed about saying what their revenue is if they want to say that? Why can't they say GreatAmerica Financial Services, a $300 million company with assets of $3.5 billion? And then forget about the life-to-date originations. Nobody cares about that, right? I just find it interesting. Embellishment. Folks, there's an article published in the Monitor Daily in 2020, and it was an interview with their founder, and he was really excited about the company, and he should be. I think the founder of this company built a great company, right? That's why I don't understand why he can't be proud of the revenue and why they got to come up with this $3.5 billion company nonsense. But in this article, he talked about the flood and how they had to move the office and all that kind of stuff. He talked about the economic downturn right after the flood. So a lot of things were going on, right? But in this interview, he says this: in last year's new business volume of $1 billion and assets over $2.2 billion. He didn't say, we're a $2.2 billion company. In 2017, for their 25th anniversary, they talk about it. GreatAmerica Financial Services announced today that it surpassed the $2 billion mark in assets. When did they change this and start saying 2.5, 2.8 billion company? It's craziness, isn't it? And folks, in the article in 2020, they said they had 600 employees. They added 150 employees since 2020. That made me question some things. And, it was in 2022 that they bought a company called IRH Capital. And they were a leasing company to the franchise market, right? And folks, in this press release, right at the first sentence, it says this: GreatAmerica Financial Services has announced it acquired the assets of IRH Capital LLC. Anytime somebody says they acquire the assets, it's kind of like, okay, was this company kicking it? Was this company struggling? You bought the assets? And the other thing is, what GreatAmerica says about this company when they do this press release was just so insane. I got to read it to you. So this is GreatAmerica discussing IRH Capital in a press release back in January of 2022, buying after they bought IRH Capital. Listen to this. Today they work with over 15 franchise concepts to provide store acquisitions, new build, remodel, refinance, and equipment purchase financing. Since inception, IRH has approved over $1 billion for their franchisee customers. What? Who cares what they've approved? Wouldn't it make more sense to say what their assets are? I mean, this is totally insane. Whoever told GreatAmerica, because it had to be somebody in marketing, I'm thinking, they're in the conference room, hey, we got to start talking about our life-to-date originations, because that's really a big number. It'll make people think we're just this really big company. They were the same people that said, hey, when we publish this about buying IRH Capital, let's talk about all the approvals that they've gotten over the years since they started. Let's not really focus on what their assets are and what they actually leased or financed. This is absurdity at so many levels. I mean, seriously, ladies and gentlemen, are you telling me that you care about, since an inception of a company, how much they approved? Or do you care about how much they actually financed? Maybe they just made a mistake and that's how much they financed over the years since their inception. But either way, it's just a nutty thing, right? And maybe that's where the 150 employees came from. Who knows? Ladies and gentlemen, there's an article in the Canada Report, and I want to bring this up because when they talk about these life-to-date finance originations, first, it drives me out of my mind. But second of all, I find a big discrepancy here. So in the Canada Report on November 8th of 2022, they're talking about those GreatAmerica are going to finance electrical vehicle charge stations. You know how I feel about that nonsense. But anyway, they say in this article, GreatAmerica, 2.5 billion company. There you go again with that, right? With life-to-date finance originations of 14 billion. Okay? And then in the latest press release about GreatAmerica buying Heritage Bank, after they cleaned it up in their About Us, it says with 3.5 plus billion in assets, and then of course they throw in the life-to-date finance originations of 16.1 billion. There's kind of a flaw in the math. Because in November of 2022, they say 2.5 billion company. We all know they really mean to say 2.5 billion in assets, right? With life-to-date finance originations of 14 billion. And then again, in 2025, it says with 3.5 billion. That's 1 billion. So 1 billion more in assets, but yet their life-to-date finance originations grew from 14 billion to 16.1 billion. That's 2 billion, 100 million, which means their life-to-date finance originations, by my math, are off by 1 billion, 100 million. And this is kind of important in my thinking, because if you're going to be a bank, people are going to come into that bank and, a lot of people, they just need to get change. Maybe there's a laundromat right next to the bank and they're going to bring you $1 and they're going to say, I need some change for the washing machine. And they're going to have to maybe give them a couple of quarters, some nickels and dimes. And you got to have the math right for that, right? That's why I think this life-to-date finance originations is ridiculous and you should just stop doing it. Ladies and gentlemen, GreatAmerica wanted to be an industrial bank. And back in 2020, they applied for an industrial bank out of Utah. And, that kind of made sense because industrial banks are a little different than charter banks or commercial banks. And, they really wanted to be this industrial bank. And then they said, okay, we don't want to do that. And they pulled it all in 2022. We don't want to do that anymore. And so I wonder, what's the difference? What's the difference between an industrial bank and a charter bank? And all this is out there. Y'all go read it. Let me just read the regulation oversight. You ready? Regulatory oversight. All FDIC insured entities, including industrial banks, are subject to FDIC and state regulatory oversight. However, a key difference lies in the Bank Holding Company Act, BHCA. Industrial banks are exempt from the BHCA, meaning a company can control an industrial bank without being subject to the restrictions and supervision that typically apply to bank holding companies. So it just seems to me that the regulatory issues around the industrial bank would have been better for GreatAmerica than, doing it through a charter bank. And then you have to ask yourself the question, how are these regulations, as GreatAmerica Financial Services owns a bank, going to affect anything that goes on with the leasing company? Just some things to think about, right? Now I want to talk about the human capital component over there at GreatAmerica as they get ready to take over this bank. And, folks, I've talked about this a lot, the lawsuit, the president files a lawsuit against Great America. That's a little bit of drama and disturbance right off the bat. Everybody loved the president of Great America, a well-respected individual who I believe got treated like pure trash, and I've done an episode on it. That's my opinion. But there's a lawsuit going. But at the end of the day, you know, in the Quarter Business Journal, the one that I shared you earlier where they talked about the revenue and all that, but folks, the founder of Great America talked about his intentions as he was retiring, as he was turning the company over to the next generation. And he talks about having a co-CEO along with his son. And the co-CEO didn't last very long. And I said, why did the co-CEO not last very long? And I said, yeah, the founder, the dad's intentions was his plan for continuity, right? And then you end up with the appointed CEO, the son's reality. And I've asked the question, was it inexperience causing the uncertainty? Why are all these people gone? We have the co-CEO gone. There's been all kinds of executives that have left this company. And we talked about this before, so there's an issue, right? I get it, some are going to retire. But folks, you know, we have in May of 2023, a senior VP, 19 years. In December of 2023, a co-CEO, 20 years. February of 2024, the president in the lawsuit, right? 20-year guy. May of 2024, VP with 27 years. July of 2024, VP with 13 years. You know, we've recently had some other folks leaving. And so, you know, I kind of made a little bit of sarcasm around the retirement thing. But folks, I think this is something we need to think about as an industry. I want to digress a little bit here. But as the industry continues to go through, you know, disruption and consolidation, we're seeing a lot less retirement parties. You know, what's going on with that? I mean, I know of one of the media outlets. There was a gentleman there. It was a long time. I'm not going to bring up his name. There's no reason to do that for this context. But this person was important to that media outlet. And all of a sudden the person's gone and really not even a thank you very much publicly, right? And we're just talking about the person that replaced them more than the person that was gone. And I didn't think the person did anything wrong that was there. Again, what's causing this? You know? Executives that were leaving Great America, you know. The president of Great America was there over 20 years, a very well-respected person in our industry, did a lot for our industry, and I just believe that whole thing was a disaster. I know there are some senior leaders still at Great America, you know. I think there's a couple of them that were there with the founder in the beginning. Let's see if they get a retirement party, but it's just something to think about. Ladies and gentlemen, the reason that I wanted to get really in depth with today's episode is because we know, I think you'd have to be naive to think that this doesn't happen, because I really believe it happens. Great America controls the narrative about them everywhere anything's published about them. They just do, and especially in our industry. And, you know, I remember talking about collaborants a long time. Got a lot of slack over it. Some people at Great America actually got to where they didn't even like me anymore. How dare you talk about collaborants? But I was trying to talk about collaborants because I knew what they were going to do with it, based on just being logical and thinking through it, right? And they ended up doing exactly what I said they would do with it. So I find this company, Vizbanking. Vizbanking is a company that does analytics on banks. Pretty in-depth analytics on banks. And Vizbanking's information on Heritage Bank was pretty alarming, so I want to share that with you. So before I get into the data, let's talk about the bank and their website, because I find this a little bit disturbing. Okay, so you go to Heritage Bank's website, and they haven't updated it since 2020. And folks, I've talked about this before, but when I see the date that's not current at the bottom of a website, it just makes me think no one's paying attention to the website. When I see a website of a bank where people go there and do online banking and stuff, and they haven't updated their website, I have a little bit of concern for that, seriously. And, you know, maybe that's something that, well, obviously, if approved by the regulators, that website will probably go down the next day anyway. But still, I thought that was interesting to me. And folks, you know, on the website it says this: "The right bank makes a difference" is our slogan for a reason. As the oldest locally owned bank in Delaware and Lynn counties, we strive to make a difference for each of our customers and the communities we serve. We not only want to be your first choice, but your friends and family's first choice as well. This bank is 100+ years old. And I'm going to share some statistics that I found on Vizbanking. And I have to ask this question: are there not a lot of folks in Iowa looking for the right bank? Because this bank's very, very small to be 100 years old. Or they don't see the right difference. Now, I'm not saying that to beat up Heritage Bank. I'm saying that banking in general. Ladies and gentlemen, the banking industry is being disrupted just as much as the print industry. You know, at the end of the day with Ray is owned basically by Tenured the Innovation Channel, is the name of my company. Tenured the Innovation Channel bank account, I've never been to the bank. Never! I mean, seriously. I got a few people that actually want to mail me a check, and when they mail me a check, I take a picture of it, it gets deposited. You know, the rest of them do a wire transfer, or they go on my website and pay. But banks and tellers and all that stuff, giving the lollipops out at the window and the dog biscuits for the dog, I mean, is that really relevant today? Seriously? And folks, I really believe that GreatAmerica just wanted the license that Heritage Bank had. I don't really think they're going to have banks spread all over Iowa. So I did a little research on the bank, got deep into that research. You know, I found a video that was put out there where the president of the bank was giving a little video and talking about the bank. And very, very nice lady. And, you know, she said she became the president when her family bought the bank. And by the way, that was 30 years ago. And she had experience in the banking industry. Family buys a bank, makes her the president. She's been there ever since. But, you know, you think about a 30-year tenure at a bank your family owns, I think maybe the family just wants to sell the bank. Nothing wrong with that. But I don't expect that she's going to be staying with the bank by any stretch of the imagination. And then, ladies and gentlemen, I get into the data from Vizbanking. First thing right off the bat that just made me say, what the hell? They only have 8 employees. I'm thinking, is that right? 8 employees? Holy crap. And so when I think about 3 bank locations, you got to have at least one person at the bank to open the door and lock it, right? So I guess the person at the bank is working the window. I mean, I don't know. 8 employees just seems like a very, very low number of employees, and maybe that's just a mistake. Who knows? But that just seems kind of crazy to me. It says they have $40.4 million in total assets. Let me say that again, 40.4 million total assets. That's really small, folks. Okay, that's a really, really small bank. So if GreatAmerica's goal is we're going to buy a bank, you know, that's really big, it has a whole bunch of deposits, and we're going to lend that money out and get money cheaper. I mean, like I said, I think this is more about just getting a licensing fee. And so, more information. So total assets, 40.4 million, and the total deposits, and this was be for the quarter ending 3/31 of 2025, so recent information, 35.5 million. This is a small bank. I mean, seriously, for the quarter ending, total deposits 35.5 million. GreatAmerica, I mean, what are they doing? Like $1 billion a year in leases? So how's this really going to help them? There was a couple alarming things on here. Return on assets are minus 0.70, so that's not good. But here's something really alarming. The efficiency ratio is 126.71. That's alarming. Efficiency ratio, let me just read that to you. An efficiency ratio has a specific meaning for banks. It is referred to as non-interest expenses divided by revenue and shows how well bank managers control their overhead or back office expenses. Since a bank's operating expenses are in the numerator and its revenue is the denominator, a lower efficiency ratio means that the bank is operating better. An efficiency ratio of 50% or under is considered optimal. Their efficiency ratio is 126.71%. That's like a lot bigger than the optimal of 50%, right? Is that sounding off an alarm? You know, the return on equity is negative 14.47%. This is a chart, talks about their total assets over time. Well, you could see that line's not going in the right direction, right? So when I looked at this data by Vizbanking, what I'm seeing is a bank that's retiring. The whole bank's retiring, right? I mean, I think the bank might have started retiring a few years ago, maybe, right? So obviously, there's something going on here, right? there's all kinds of information out there, ladies and gentlemen, but the one I wanted to look at was this net income. You know, they had a little bit of a spike here in the third quarter of 2022, but boom, it ain't going in the right direction. And so again, is this a bank that's basically served its purpose in the marketplace? Been around over 100 years. His family's owned it for 30. You know, the decision to sell it to GreatAmerica, is it their way out? Probably so. Let me wrap up with some closing questions. Who will run Heritage Bank? 8 employees. Obviously, I'm thinking that well, I mean, I guess she could be staying, but I would imagine that president's going to leave the day GreatAmerica buys them. You know, if Heritage Bank is as small and immaterial as described in these Vizbanking reports, how does this help GreatAmerica Financial? Seriously. I mean, I could understand if they bought a bank that was running really well, everything was great, big deposits, right? Lots of assets, human capital that's going to stick around and run the bank. But I'm looking at a bank that's basically, they're going to buy and take over immediately. And then when I say take over, that means they have to have their own intellect to take it over. Why is Heritage Bank, a 100-plus-year-old local institution, so small and immaterial as described by the Vizbanking reports? Why is that? It's a 100-year-old bank. With much of the GreatAmerica brain trust gone, what is the plan to build a bank all while managing a lease company with many untested leaders? And folks, I already showed you, there's been a lot of brain trust leaving GreatAmerica. And now we're going to buy a bank that's very, very small, that basically is going to be up to them to turn this thing around. Who's going to do it? Who's going to do it? And folks, I have to say, will the GA founder get more involved in the business? Is Tony coming back? And what is the real reason GreatAmerica Financial Services is buying a bank? And I wanted to end with that question because, you know, I think a lot of times organizations and founders and entrepreneurs have a dream. And they become obsessed with that dream. And sometimes, not everything they dream needs to be executed on, in my thinking. And so what was the real reason for buying the bank? How will the bank help GreatAmerica? Time will tell. Hopefully it works out for them. Hopefully it works out for those dealer friends of mine. But there's a lot more to this story than what I believe will be whitewashed and plastered all over the internet. And everybody watching me knows this. Status quo is the killer of all that'll be invented. Don't get stuck there, and I'll see you all tomorrow.